Shall we begin?
Sure. Yeah, so thanks everybody for joining us today. And thank you, Melanie, our special guest. And as we mentioned, there is a recording in process. You are welcome to introduce yourselves in the chat. And Carrie and Carolina and I have been organizing this System of Systems Thinkers Women in Systems Thinking speaker series. And so Melanie is the third speaker in the series, and the series continues, and we'll put the link in the chat so you can see the other speakers we have on the docket for upcoming months. And I think unless there's anything else to attend to, I'll hand it off to you, Carrie.
Thank you, Felicia. Welcome, everyone. And before I talk a little bit about the context for today's conversation, I'd also just like to acknowledge my colleagues, Felicia and Carolina. We've been working together for over a year to live into the question of how might we get systems thinkers to work together more collaboratively. And that is part of the spirit that we are bringing to this conversation together today. And it's very fitting as I introduce Melanie Goodchild, my wonderful colleague, who is writing and leading on the topic of relational systems thinking. And so today's conversation and really engagement is going to be around the work that Melanie has done in relational systems thinking. And we have an hour and a half here together. We hope you all can stay through the end of the conversation because Melanie's going to offer some context initially around the concepts of relational systems thinking. And then we're going to go into a little bit of practice. We're going to have an opportunity to relate to one another through her work. And that's going to give us an opportunity to pair. We're going to journal. Actually, we're going to invite you to journal for a few minutes. And then we're going to go into pairs, and then we're going to come back into the plenary. So there's some activities, some different rhythms of the conversation today, and some engagement. So for those of you who'd like to take a moment to grab a piece of paper and a pen, or perhaps you have your journal right there, we'll have some time, a few minutes after Melanie goes through her slides to reflect on what we're learning around relational systems thinking. So with that, I'll just say that it's just a deep honor to have Melanie here with us. I've had the privilege of being her colleague through the Academy for Systems Change, and really just would love to be able to sit at her feet for the rest of my life and continue to receive the wisdom that she's sharing with us from her relations. And she's a published academic author. And so for those of you who haven't had an opportunity to read her most recent publications through the Journal of Awareness-Based Systems Change, we shared those with you in advance, and we'll share them here again. And I just cannot encourage you enough to delve into her work. It's very dense. I'll just say that I have to keep reading it and reading it and reading it again to kind of continue to absorb all that is contained therein. And so, you know, I hope that this is the beginning of many conversations that we can have with Melanie, because we have much to learn from her. And so, yeah, why don't we begin? Melanie, do you have anything you want to share with us before you start your slides?
Yes, yeah, thank you, Carrie. So, bonjour and dino maganaduk, that's greetings to you, all of my relatives. Mino Gijep, good morning if you're in that time zone. Good middle of the night if you're somewhere else in the world. Mino Gijep, it's a beautiful day. Anishinaabe Kweyanda. So I'm Anishinaabe or Ojibwe, and I'm here in Anishinaabe Aki, which is Anishinaabe territory in Thunder Bay, Ontario, on a family vacation. So I'm in a hotel room and have some screaming cousins coming over to swim in the hotel pool soon. And I'm going to say some things in my language, which is part of our traditional protocol. So Wabshki Ogichidakwe is Anang Indigenous cause, Waba Anang Akwe Indigenous cause. Those are my spirit names. Moose and Dodem Moose, so Moose clan. Melanie Jaganashi, Indigenous cause Jaganashi Ayang. So I'm also known as Melanie in English, and part of my work is on decolonizing aspects of systems thinking and complexity science, but also re-indigenizing them. So decolonizing kind of reflects a binary way of thinking, and re-indigenizing moves beyond the binary. So when you're de-escalating, decolonizing, de-doing something, it's always in relationship to the first thing, which is colonialism. So a lot of my work focuses on re-indigenizing, and so our protocols to introduce ourselves is that we say our spirit names, because in Anishinaabe, Gik, and Oswin, our original ways of knowing, we are spirit beings on a human journey. And so a long time ago, our elders would have found out from the spirits what we're called, and we would have known those names for most of our lives. But because of colonization, our communities lost some of those practices, and they've been revitalized. And so many of us go to the elders now and find out what we're called in the spirit world. So I have 2 spirit names, and that's what they will call me when I go back to the spirit world and go back to my ancestors, which is a physical transition that, in the West we call dying. But someday I will be back there in the spirit world. And so I said, Apajogo Miigwech Bizindawiyag, that's thank you for listening. And I said, Bonjour and Dinawamaganaduk, that's greetings to all of my relatives. And so in our language and in our ceremonies, we always come from a place of kinship, that we are all related. And I say we are all related, it's everything in the universe is related. So it's not human centric. It's actually a connection to all of the beings, the non-humans, so the animals, but also the water, the rivers, the ocean, the trees, the desert. And so a lot of that comes through, I think, in this concept of relational systems thinking. And I do have a slide deck to share. So I will do that. I'll screen share. And I think it's going to help with metabolizing or ingesting what I'm sharing. I also invite you to have a cup of tea, water, food. I prefer to think of visiting with people as a yarn. And so yarning comes from our brothers and sisters in Australia, the Aboriginal peoples. It's a cultural dialogue. It's a culturally based dialogue. And in yarning, I've been taught by Auntie Vicky Charles at the Australian Centre for Social Innovation, and my friend and brother Tyson Young-Comporta, who wrote a beautiful beautiful book called Sand Talk: How Indigenous Thinking Can Save the World. Been taught about their business, their cultural business, and part of that includes yarning. And so when you yarn, your narrative is welcomed. We have 2 types of stories in my culture, Adzukan and Dabajmoin. And so today I'm sharing the Dabajmoin, the story of how I came to find out about this thing called systems thinking and systems practice, and really try to understand systems transformations from our perspective, and have also been in conversation or yarning with a lot of knowledge keepers and elders. I was really fortunate that even though my mom and dad, my dad is Delaney and my mom is Melinda, and they halved it up and called me Melanie. It's spelled like Melanie, but it's pronounced Melanie. They were both sent to residential school. So my dad went to Indian day school in Spanish, a little town called Spanish. So he went to Spanish Indian day school, Indian residential school. And my mom went to Roman Catholic Indian day school in her community. And so Bigtagong, Nishnabeg, and Donjaba, and Kitagonzibi and Donjaba, those are the 2 First Nations I'm from. Kitagonzibi means Guard River, and Bigtagong Nishnabeg is used to be called the Ojibways of the Pic River First Nation. So that's all in this territory of Anishinaabe. So that gives you a little bit of context for me and my work. And I'm also an academic. I'm finishing my PhD in social and ecological sustainability at the University of Waterloo. And I started that program in 2015, and that's where I first heard about systems dynamics. And I started to read Western systems thinkers. My professor is Frances Wesley, who was a real leader in social innovation here. She's retired now. And her work builds on and incorporates a lot of systems thinking and complexity science. And so I started to read Dana Meadows' work and Peter Senge, Otto Scharmer. But as I was reading all of that material, I was always kind of decolonizing or re-indigenizing it as I went. I would take a step back and say, well, how would our ancestors think about whatever, a feedback loop or path dependency or, you know, a system archetype? I started to ask our elders and our knowledge keepers, how would we say that? Because our language is very distinct in terms of encoding our complexity thinking in the language. And that's what I'm going to share with you today. So I'll share my screen because it'll make a little more sense when I do that. I'm just going to do this, move that, make it full screen. Okay, so hopefully you can see this. So relational systems thinking, that's how change is going to come from our Earth Mother. That was a paper I wrote last year as part of my doctoral studies. It was based on conversations, yarns I had had with 4 Haudenosaunee, Mohawk elders, and 2 systems thinkers. And that paper, as of last couple of weeks ago, has had 17,344 downloads, which is, I think, pretty unique for an academic paper. It's open source on the Journal of Awareness-Based Systems Change. And so I'm going to tell you the story of writing that paper and what I presented. And this is what led to my thinking about decolonizing systems thinking. I think John Mohawk, the late Seneca scholar, speaks to this when he says, we now have people who are very clearly among the best scientists who are willing to agree that there are limits to the knowledge that science can have about nature. We're reaching a place in which there's ever wider agreement that poetry gives us as much information about our relationship with the universe as telescopes do, and that those 2 strains can live together and complement one another harmoniously. Those 2 things can happen, and that's actually not dissimilar to my culture, which asserts that on the one hand, there are dreams and visions, and on the other hand, there's a responsibility to maintain a clear vision of reality. Those 2 streams of thought and reactions have to live cooperatively together. And so I'm Anishinaabe, as I mentioned, and I'm not Seneca, I'm not Haudenosaunee, I'm not Mohawk, but when I was writing and studying, I was living in traditional Haudenosaunee Confederacy territory. I just recently moved back home, and I now live back where my people are from in Three Fires Confederacy territory, which are the Anishinaabe, Potawatomi, Onodawa. So because I was living near Niagara Falls, Ontario, I was in a relationship with the sentient landscape there, which was the place of the first treaty between the Indigenous peoples there, or the Haudenosaunee, and the new people, the settlers. And those settlers were Dutch, and then eventually the French, and then the British. And so what John Mohawk is talking about here, those 2 streams, that way of holding 2 different realities is reflected in the Two-Row Wampum Belt. So this is the Two-Row Wampum Belt. You see each of those little shells, those are sacred wampum shells from the ocean. So there's a ceremony for the harvesting of each of those shells. They are strung on a belt, and this represents the covenant or the treaty. It's part of the Silver Covenant chain, which were a series of treaties between the Haudenosaunee and as I mentioned, the Dutch and the French and the British. So in this belt, the white beads represent the river of life. The 2 purple columns represent the Dutch merchant sailing ship and the Iroquois birch bark canoe. So it was a treaty of peace, friendship, and respect. But it also signified that these cultures or these nations were sovereign nations that were equal but differentiated. So there wasn't a, a reasoning that either one would conquer the other or that they would interfere with each other. But there was an understanding that from time to time they would help each other. And the reason they would help each other is because they were now sharing the river of life. So this was a realization on the part of the indigenous peoples that the newcomers were not going to be going back, that they were there to stay. And so they needed to set out some ethical ways of being in relationship with each other. So as I mentioned, I was in conversations a couple of years ago with different scholars. And so I was in conversation with Peter Senge and Otto Scharmer at MIT. I was recording conversations. Actually, Peter had invited me to co-write a paper. But at the same time, I was in conversations in Six Nations with 4 Haudenosaunee elders, Dan Longboat, Diane Longboat, Kevin Deere, who's a faith keeper in the Mohawk Trail Longhouse in Ganawage, and a Tuscarora knowledge keeper named Rick Hill. And I was writing 2 separate papers. And as I was writing these 2 papers, I could hear in their stories the same message, but really spoken differently, different reference points, different types of knowledge being shared, but yet the same messages. And so I positioned the paper in a way to help readers with the 2-column thinking, with a way that the 2 streams of thought could live simultaneously in their minds. And so I wrote in a 2-row visual code after I saw Goodchild's Mohawk poems, where he wrote them in a 2-row visual code. Based on the paper, I started presenting it at workshops, at universities, in different types of forums. And I started to develop a model. So the second paper, the one that just came out a couple of weeks ago in the same journal, is called Relational Systems Thinking, the Debajimawin, or story of re-theorizing systems thinking and complexity science. So if you look at this image here on your screen, that's essentially like a wampum belt. So there's a column on the left, there's a column on the right, and in between is the river of life. And that space between is what my uncle Dan Longboat. And so Dan Longboat, who's one of the elders that I had spoken with, is also my spiritually adopted uncle. He talked about the sacred space between different worldviews. So in a lot of systems practice right now, I've seen in the field, there's an interest in decolonizing work, but also an interest in multiple ways of knowing, being, seeing, doing. So this is now become a theoretical model, a dynamic interface model, because it happens at the nexus of worldviews. It's a theoretical living model because Indigenous cultures are living. We're not, kind of suspended in the past for reasoning synergistically in the space between ways of knowing. So on the left could be systems thinking from a Western perspective. And so, of course, when I share with folks who aren't familiar with systems thinking, I kind of teach about what that is. But for you probably are pretty familiar with it. But really in the West, it was a response to scientific reductionism, to scientism, to rationalism, to things coming out of the Enlightenment, to the Cartesian dualism. All of it was responded to, and there was a recognition of irreducible wholeness, and that the relationship and interaction between the parts of the whole were what was important. So you couldn't just reduce it. So, John Mohawk talked about telescopes, and we could also talk about microscopes. So there's the principles of nonlinearity, resilience, complexity, vicious and virtuous cycles, the leading up to the concepts of that Peter introduced, like talks about mental models, personal mastery, the technologies of systems modeling, the Club of Rome. I mean, all that work that came out of the West. On the right on this model is Anishinaabe Amino Bimadazawin. And that's our highest principle of life for Anishinaabe. It means the good life. And so Bimadazawin is life, and we're always seeking life, but we're seeking the good life. And the good life is about being in right relations with ourselves, with each other, other humans, but also in right relations with the natural world. And so it really informs our ethics. So Gik and Daswin is our original way of knowing, and Damawin is our wisdom. And it's relational. It's a relational and spiritual way of life. So I was, drawing on that. But then I was reading ecology, and I was reading about systems thinking. And I found those ways of thinking to have a deep anthropocentric bias. They were very human centric. And the definitions of things like sustainability and the Sustainable Development Goals were really focused on human beings. And in my culture, it's always about relationships and having a spiritual relation with our kinship, with all of our relatives. And so on the left, if we think about education and the acquisition of systems awareness and systems, I guess you might call it curriculum, it's about an individual pursuit of knowledge. Whereas on the right, we talk about Minigojawin, which is your sacred knowledge bundle. Minigo, that which is given to you is a win from somebody else. And so I often do workshops on gathering items for your sacred knowledge bundle, and you're collecting Kikwenan, which are our teachings, and Gichiga Kinuamatawin is the act of greater deep teaching. And so we're kind of always in a process of teaching each other and learning. In the middle is relational systems thinking. So it's kind of a bridge that invites people who might identify with, either systems thinking or the Madisawin, and have experienced the space between as a clash or conflict. Because there's heavy power dynamics within Western education systems, my epistemology and cosmology is often dismissed as folklore, as not being scientific, not rational. And the recognition of native science, which Pueblo scholar Gregory Cajete writes about, or ancestor mind, prophecy, dreams, the four directions teaching, that's the four directions teaching there, the medicine wheel, the white, yellow, red, black are the four directions, the four great medicines, the four phases of life, the four parts of the human being, spiritual, mental, physical, emotional. It's the four great nations, the yellow, red, black, and white peoples that come from the four directions. It's the four sacred beings that live in those cardinal directions. All of those teachings, I mean, you could, talk for days about just different elements of that teaching there, the Anishinaabe medicine wheel. So in the middle is this two-row thinking, this invitation to kind of dance with different ways and not completely dismiss, but nor are you giving up. It's not that systems thinking or Western thinking is inferior. That binary of superiority or hierarchical binaries is also an invitation to transcend those. So relational systems thinking is an invitation to transcend or reason synergistically, meaning reason with energy. And the energy that you're tapping into is spiritual, mental, physical, and emotional. And our elders often call those frequencies. So when I'm doing systems work and I'm coaching, systems groups or innovation labs or, whatever, or Theory U hubs, I'm often talking about how do you build in those different frequencies into your work. In other words, how do you, particularly, I think in the West, we really focus on mental. And so we try to think our way out of things. And the relational systems thinking, I called it that because I wanted to, to reach out to systems thinkers, but it's really about systems sensing, systems being. It works at all those different levels. And this is what my Uncle Dan calls cultural fluency, because I'm an Anishinaabe. I don't know the true wampum belt. That's not like part of my culture, but they taught me about it and said, share that with the world. People need to hear about these types of teachings. And I'll just finish up with this slide saying that, healing self and systems is a huge part of this work. I mean, when someone recognizes that they themselves are part of the systems that they're trying to transform, that's a very emotional experience because, if we're used to finding the bad folks that caused something, the oppressors, then we're sort of off the hook, I guess, in a way from, finding and being a part of the solutions that might address those wicked problems. And so I focus quite a bit on healing self and systems in my work. And I find a way to do that is having tea and a yarn. That an embodied practice is a really beautiful pathway to doing systems awareness work. And certainly going on the land is a huge part of that. So there's a beautiful book called Deer and Thunder, Indigenous Ways of Restoring the World by Andean elder Arkin Lashwala. I've never met him, but I share this quote because it really reflects, I think, the relational systems thinking model. I can now practice a way of reasoning that does not take sides, but instead allows two opposites to dance together until the face of a third presence starts showing up. He's talking about that in his language, that there are energies, there's masculine and feminine energies. I have that in my culture. Women are the water protectors and responsible for water, and now protect water. There's water walkers. And the men are Ishkode, fire. So water's Nebe, waters, Nebish, and Ishkode is fire. And so there are fire keepers. And there's a teaching built within that of balance as well. Too much water would, douse the fire. Too much fire would evaporate the water. And so there's always a teaching of holding those energies. And those energies can be, they're not necessarily, like biological sex. They're energies about what you're tapping into. And so he talks about how he can tap into masculine and feminine energies in his language and transcend the binary of this is, one or the other. And I thought that was a beautiful way to think about this. And so in my studies, I started to read a lot of science, complexity science, scientific and sort of systems thinking definitions. And English is really kind of a low context language, very specific and specific to it, and has a lot of definitions. And so I kept hearing about resilience, kind of from the C.S. Hollings work and Walker and Salt, about the capacity of a system to absorb a shock and not flip into something else. And there's Walker and Salt's definition there about retaining its, function, structure, and feedbacks. And for a system, so for example, a lake, to flip into something else. And I think about when Lake Erie was dying, or when Lake Mead is at risk, if it were to become a desert, it would not have the same identity. So I asked two language speakers, because I'd never heard, our elders talk about like resilience in that way. When my cousin, Renee Mishaki, he said, resilience in our language, the original language, it's Sibiskagad, Sibe river, Biska, flexible, Gad it is. You might say that resilience is described as a river flowing flexibly through the land. In the Snabe Mawin, which is our language, is embedded in the land. My sister Eleanor Skeed, she said it's Mama Sinjige is the act of twists and turns and moves. Mama Sinjawan is the water flow in twisting and turning. And there always has to be context for Ojibwe words. So in our wisdom, I guess, coming to knowing, knowledge resides in the land, and it's revealed to you through personal experiences on the land. So Eleanor said, are you near a lake? And what I was doing was I was writing a paper for school. I was writing a 10,000 word essay for my comprehensive exam about resilience. And I said, yeah, I'm near the Nith River, near the university. And she said, well, she's teaching you. That river is teaching you about resilience. So you should go down and do ceremony at that river and thank her. And so I went and I did ceremonies by that river. And I took my medicine bundle and sat there and offered that river, the Nebe, the Sibe, I offered her Sibe offerings. And I thanked the river when I defended and presented my comprehensive exam. So the reason I'm going to now switch a little bit here to talk about language is that within settler colonial history, which is all of Turtle Island, so Canada and the United States, both of those countries are founded on something called the Doctrine of Discovery and Terra Nullius. So the Doctrine of Discovery was a papal decree that anybody who wasn't Christian, this is back in the 1400s, was not human. And therefore, we, millions of Indigenous people on Turtle Island, were dehumanized in that moment, considered not human, considered savages and uncivilized, because we didn't have the same religion. And therefore, the land was empty. Terra Nullius means empty. And so that's the founding of Canada and the United States. Part of the assimilationist policies and the committing of genocide here was to attack our families and our languages. And so that's the history of boarding schools, residential schools. And in those schools, it was illegal to speak your language. And a lot of the ceremonies that, I grew up being able to participate in. Just a generation or two before me, they would have been arrested. And so 7 Generations Education Institute's an Indigenous institute not far from here, where I am today. And Anishinaabe Moda is waking up Ojibwe. So Anishinaabe Moda, there's a lot of Indigenous languages that are now protected and that we're trying to revitalize them. And so I gave this presentation at their program. The presentation, the second half of the slides that I'm about to show you, and they were really happy to hear this. So I was talking to a lot of language speakers, and they were happy to hear about how our ancestral languages encode a systems thinking and complexity mindset. And I'll show you what I mean. So Rick Hill, I'm just going to kind of quote him in the middle. He says that our creation stories and our prophecies are the roadmap to an interconnected web, that this is the ultimate system that we exist by. And I think in the end, if you compare Anishinaabe creation and Haudenosaunee creation stories in this region, which was Niagara Falls, there is a commonality about why the world was created and why humans were created to inhabit the land. That's the knowledge we need to uncover. He says, I was working on this project called the Cosmogram of our universe through Haudenosaunee eyes to revisualize, because you have to have that when you start looking at that, the language. It explains things a little differently. I think that's important. When you can revisualize creation as a whole entity, a functioning entity beyond the sky world to below the turtle, when you re-envision it in 3 dimensions in Dolby Stereo, you will then innately understand your relationship and your place in that universe. And you won't need a textbook or somebody to explain to you what you need to be doing. You will embrace it. That's what I meant by having faith in the unseen. It's worked for 10,000 years. It's begging us now to re-engage with it. But we get so distracted trying to change things, change education here and there. I think we've stifled the ability of our kids to feel that vibrational energy message from the earth. So how do Indigenous languages, and then it's just a few more slides and then we'll move into the exercise together. This is from a linguist that I read her book, and the book is called The Indigenizing Poetics, the Decolonizing Poetics of Indigenous Literatures. So there's a characteristic of a lot of Indigenous languages, and it's called holophrasis. And so holophrasis comes from the Greek for the word whole, from late Latin, meaning word phrases, which in turn originates from the Greek verb phrase, meaning to declare or tell. So a holophrasis or a hollow phrase, we arrive at something like to declare or tell whole. So hollow phrases are holistic expressions, and they're very characteristic in Anishinaabe, Mowin, and other languages. So we arrive at something like to declare or tell in one long word. They look long compared to English. So in Plains Cree, which I'm not a Cree speaker, but they would say, Kinote he asimo sta tinawau, which translates to, I want to tell you folks a story. So a single word in our languages stands for a whole sentence. It's a hollow phrase. And so because language is so important, it's how we produce discourse, how we often represent and produce knowledge. It's like a holophrastic heuristic to understanding the complexity mindset of our old ones, Gitche and Anishinaabe, the ancestors. And so this single word expression includes verbs, subjects, and objects in one phrase. I'm going to give you some examples. And so in Canada here, we have a province called Saskatchewan, and it comes from a Plains Cree hollow phrase. Kisiskasawin, it flows fast or swiftly, and Sipe, river. That's how they got the name, the province called Saskatchewan. But even when we translate it back, it becomes an English noun phrase. And so my colleague, Teokasin Ghost Horse, who's Lakota and a language speaker, he talks about the nounification that English does to our thinking and through speaking English, all of us. And so it becomes modified by a relative clause. So instead of, it flows fastly, river, it becomes the river that flows swiftly. It's that's an issue here, right? So if it's the river, it becomes an it. It's no longer a sentient being. It's no longer alive. It's no longer flowing. It's the river. And that nounification, I think, socializes us to a more simple way of thinking. And it allows for the commodification of things like a tree, a river, a rock. They become natural resources. And then it's easy to destroy them and exploit them and abuse them. So here's an example of a hollow phrase. I cannot say it very well. This is blueberry pie on Ojibwe, and it's 66 characters. The best way to understand it is to break it down. So minibash kimis sinigane, bitu sijinigane, ibadagwe weshigane, ba wa jigane. And then you string that all together, which I can't do very well. And that becomes blueberry pie. So blueberries that are cooked, something in between something else, flattened, and then making the blueberry crust. The whole idea here is that it's very verb based. And so there's the central component of most Indigenous languages is the verb. And so you're always in the process of doing something. You're not naming something or defining it as a thing. So I'm not going to even try to say these, but this is an example of a Mohawk word, of a Plains Cree word, and unuvialuktan. I do not think I will go to the new store with you. Is that a speaker would say that word as one word. And so this is from Mariki Newhouse's book, and it really helped me process why I was asking the elders all the time, how would we say something? Because it was really important to know that. And so this is another Anishinaabe word, Jim Misawa Badaming. It means positive window shopping for your future, according to this elder Earl. But then I asked Eleanor Skeed, and I said, how would you kind of define that word for me? And so I just gave her the word without telling her Earl's translation. And she said it was looking, I would relate to it like I was looking at the pastry and goodies behind the glass and hoping for them when I was a kid, but also implies a plan to buy them too. So it's like, let's show him or her so he or she could wish for. Jamis is to desire or wish for. So it's like window shopping too. And so I kind of describe what I do in systems work and what other systems transformation people do as positive window shopping for the future. I think that's what the Theory U process is, 3 horizons, compassionate systems thinking, the work we do with schools, that Peter Senge does with schools, the work that I do with the Wolf-Willow Institute for Systems Learning, where we work with a lot of people on an introduction to kind of the complexity mindset of systems awareness. And down here, Wasa Nabada means we look in all directions. So now we move into hopefully the fun part. This usually has had very positive feedback. So if you're not a language speaker of one of those languages, so we're not speaking Lakota, I don't speak Lakota, how does this help me in my, accessing a complexity mindset? Well, in Sand Talk, Tyson Young-Comporta talks quite a bit about story mind, metaphors, ancestor mind. And so how do we access a complexity mindset or a metaphoric way of thinking? So this is an invitation for you to take out your journals, as Carrie mentioned at the beginning, and to give a holophrastic reading to your mental models. So of course, understanding our own mental models. And so mental models in systems thinking is often defined as the way that we assume things about the world, our beliefs. We often don't question them, right? They become hegemonic. They become so part of our reality that we don't sit back and say, where did that belief come from? Where did that mental model come from? So it can be something as simple as an assumption you have about behavior to kind of a larger theory. What's really important is that mental models, though, then inform action. And so we make decisions and we judge things and we analyze things and we do diagnostics based on these mental models that we don't always question. So the invitation here is to choose an English word that you are emotionally attached to in your current systems change work that kind of defines your purpose. Why are you doing systems thinking or systems transformation work? And let's pretend that word doesn't exist in English. So this word that you love no longer exists in the English language. Tell the story of that word so that we understand the complexity mindset needed to sense into it with you. So that's the invitation. So we'll journal for the next 3 or 4 minutes, And then we're going to put you in pairs. When you go into pairs, what I'd invite you to do is tell the story of that word, but you don't share the word. Okay, so for example, if in my mind, I'm choosing the word decolonization, I'm engaging with that word, and here on the right are the images I chose. And so I thought about, it's a journey, it's healing, it takes place on the land, the river flowing, it's planting new ideas. That's how I would define it. But I don't say the word decolonization when I tell the story. That's the invitation. Does anyone have any questions about the invitation? Just anything for clarification? And then I will share that screen again. You can raise your hands if you have any questions. I don't see any hands up. Okay, so Carrie, let's it's almost 1:45. Let's take the next 5 minutes for everyone to journal. I'd also say you're welcome to share other languages. You know, I work with Arowana Hayashi, and she'll share words in Japanese that we just don't even have in English. So you're welcome to share words from your language as well, and images. So take out a sketchbook if that's better for you, but really help us understand the complexity of that word that you really have attached yourself to for your work. All right, I'm going to leave this up here. Couple more minutes for the journaling. Okay, so as you wrap up your journaling or sketching, we're going to invite you into pairs. And the invitation again is to introduce yourself to whoever you're meeting. And then we'll be in pairs for, I think, about 15 minutes. So you'll have, 7 or 8 minutes each to tell your story, tell the story of that. And then you can reflect on it. So the point's not to guess the other person's word, but I know from previous experiences, it's very tempting. And that's okay. I mean, someone can guess. But the idea is not to share your word at the beginning. It's to really engage with it and have, a conversation about it. And then the other person shares their story about their word. And then with any time left over, you can kind of, reflect on it and just be in relationship with each other. And then we'll come back to the big group and kind of reflect on the experience. So that's the invitation. We'll go into breakouts for about 15 minutes, and then we'll come back for some yarning.
Okay, thank you, Melanie. So just a quick note to say that if we're going to send you into the breakouts, and if you have any trouble, you can hit the blue button at the corner to come back to the main room, and we'll sort you out if you have any problems or technical difficulties.
You'll also have, Carolina, you're going to set a timer, right? So that people will have
Yes,
some indication.
Yes, you will have a timer at the top, and the rooms will close automatically after 15 minutes. So I'm gonna send you everyone out now. So please enjoy and have a nice conversation about your word. Sarah, are you still there? Okay.
Are we still recording the breakout?
I can pause it.
Our room? Okay.
Yeah.
Just if you want to
hang
say.
on.
Is already here with us, and folks will be starting to drop in very soon in the next few seconds.
Welcome back. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you for staying. I know that I'm aware I didn't participate in the exercise, but I'm looking forward to doing it. And I know that for me, this wisdom that Melanie shares both through her written work and just in circle, it's very, it's dense. I don't know other way to describe it than it's dense. It's like super rich and dense. And so I can imagine that some of you are just, trying to process like I am. Anyway, we'd love to spend the next few minutes hearing from a couple of volunteers about what the experience was like for you, what you might have learned, what maybe some of the challenges were, and then we'll move into a few minutes of Q&A for Melanie. And in between those two exercises, I'm going to offer a little bit more context about the work we're doing here and what brings us here. So would anyone like to volunteer about their experience? You can either raise your hand or just take yourself off mute.
I'll go ahead if no one else does here. Yep, and for both of us, I was in a breakout with Felicia there, and it was one of those where I think just the general dynamic as a whole, one is definitely tempted to especially because for both of us, the words were in English, it's very tempting to overthink some of it. That, for instance, trying to dive into the context, trying to dive into connotations, whereas it ended up being so delicious, and for her it was just being relationships, where I was thinking of, okay, so how would a relationship function? Would it enable, would it co-create, and all those things? So that's a common temptation that perhaps many of you also felt in the breakouts. And then personally on my end, it's quite a challenge, given that for me, just being one with many strong opinions weakly held, that very little I could find that I was particularly emotionally attached to. So I ended up picking one that I was a bit more attached to than the others, in the sense that, say, if you were to erase every other word, like what's one word that I would absolutely hang on to? And basically that was pluralism, to the extent that it's really what enables those of very different and often conflicting values, experiences, goals, and whatnot to actually functionally coexist in the same spaces without feeling that the existence of one is a threat to the existence of the other. So that's the thrust of what we were discussing during the breakouts. Felicia,
Thank
anything
you,
to add?
Yangbo. Yeah. Thank you so much. That was a beautiful share. Pluralism. Alyssa.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll just share. It was such a joyful experience, and it was just for both of our words. It was such a beautiful journey to be taken on, and I was so amazed by how rich it was. And I was kind of the first time I heard, I was kind of like taking notes, because I was so surprised by how many scenes there were, and we saved sharing our words till the very end. And for sure, by the time we shared the words, they were way too small. They were way too small for all the places that we went just in the description. And thank you. I've heard a lot about process-oriented languages, but this exercise really lit it up for me in a whole new way. Thank you.
That's a beautiful share, Alyssa. By the way, did you try to guess each other's words, and did either of you succeed at that? Or did you restrain yourselves?
I found I didn't want to know, but then at the end, I couldn't leave without finding out.
But you hadn't figured it out.
I had not figured it out.
Interesting.
Even though it came up in conversation, I had not. It's like
You got lost in the complexity of it.
Yeah, I had
Great.
more fun in the longer version.
Do we have any last shares before we move into Q&A? Suparna, please.
Just a brief one. It almost felt like a meditation. I've been working with this word for the past, I would say, 2 years now. It's a word I keep coming back to orient my work. And it is, I'll just share, it's accompaniment. And that's why I joined this, because it's relational was the other word I've anchored my work around. And I've had visuals, and it just really felt amazing to almost have this meditation of the word, which I hadn't done. So thank you for that.
Amazing. Catherine, do I see you raising your hand? Okay, please go ahead.
So, Soprano, you just stimulated for me an interesting thought. My word was autopoiesis, and it's about self-making. And often we hold it as about us, an individual doing something, and yet we do it in relationship. That's the whole point. You can't self-make without being in relationship. It's not possible. It's that the meaning you make by the relationship you're touching that inspires you to create whatever it is you create. So I really appreciate that. Thank you.
It's really beautiful, Catherine. And I want to just reference back to the conversation prior to this one with Nora Bateson, where she talks about autopoiesis. For those of you who haven't had a chance to see that video, we'll be sure to share that with you after today.
Carrie,
Yes,
can I
ma'am.
just interject and just thank everyone for accepting the invitation for that exercise. And I'll just share that when I've presented this and then invited people to think about their word, Tioxin Ghost Horse, who's a Lakota elder and studies the Lakota language, he did the reverse, and he thought about the words in English that don't exist in the Lakota. And he said, so for example, we don't have a word for art. And so when we name something and there's a separation, and so he was thinking about how he would do the exercise. And I just thought I would share that he now thinks about, how do I, think about art when there's a reason there's no word for art in Lakota. And then we would yarn about that. So it's kind of a neat exercise to, and folks have asked me, can they share that exercise? And for sure, I welcome you to share that with people. Miigwech.
Thank you so much, Melanie. Yango, did you have a final point?
Yeah.
Yeah, just a very quick follow-up to Melanie's point is it does sound like, because incidentally just late last night I was diving into, I happened to come across this factoid about how the founder of IKEA was dyslexic, and hence that was why he decided to give proper nouns to name the different pieces of goods that were sold in stores when the concept was first being developed, because those proper nouns, instead of having numbers and the symbols and whatnot, made it easier for him to remember what those products were. So, I mean, perhaps there's some relation there in terms of bringing that into practice.
That's beautiful. Different ways of knowing. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating and for these beautiful shares. I would like to just offer a little bit of context before we move into Q&A, which is that I really wanted to repeat the statement that Melanie made about this notion of positive window shopping for our future, which I just loved. I thought it was such a delicious metaphor, and it actually really reminded me of the reason that we're really all here, which is this series was conceived in the spirit of honoring the work of Dana Meadows, and I'm really touched to see that Marta Cerroni is here today in our audience as a partner and the first speaker in our series, channeling Dana's work during this 50th year since the publication of Limits to Growth. And so, many people may not know about Dana's work, and her archives are housed at the Academy for Systems Change, and we can share that with you. But one of the things that she came to in her own work is this notion of visioning. And so it's really wonderful to think about the relationality of this work, Melanie, that you're bringing to us, and the discoveries that Dana made over time. And I also just want to take a quick moment to acknowledge that the other, spirit in which we're coming together is a spirit of collaboration, meaning part of the emphasis of this work that we are doing together, Felicia, Carolina, and myself, who I want to just acknowledge, by the way, that Carolina is in Japan and it's 3 a.m. So I just want to express a lot of gratitude for her presence here and shepherding this conversation. But we are accompanied by really just an estimable selection of partners from around the world who are committed in the same spirit to these conversations that inquire into the question about what is possible in the way of collaboration in the systems field. And so we are grateful for their support. We are honored to have them in the fold. We welcome other partners to join us as this conversation series and our work together continues to evolve. And we couldn't be more thrilled that they are committed in the same spirit to this notion of breaking down silos in the systems field for the possibilities of making the world a better place. So we just want to acknowledge and thank them. And now I invite you to raise your hands if you have questions for Melanie. We have about 10 minutes for Q&A. Did I miss anything, my colleagues? Okay. I'm going to hand it over to you, Felicia, for this portion.
Yeah, so let's see. I do see one hand up, Karen, and let me come to you in a moment, Karen. I just wanted to kind of kick off the Q&A with partially an observation and partially a question for you, Melanie, which is, I really had the distinct feeling as you were sharing that it's almost like, I don't know, it reminds me of like Plato's cave myth or something where people are kind of enchanted by their shadows on the wall and they don't notice there's a light projecting and they're just staring at the shadows. It's almost like we're all walking around with like our heads in a bag or something, like this idea that we need to, like, you might be able to look at the river or a leaf and learn something, and we're like, really? You know, so I keep having that feeling kind of repeated, like oh, the nature might have something to teach us. Oh my gosh. You know, like I keep repeatedly over years, and I myself am part of that sort of normal world, quote unquote, normal, very abnormal, of just being boxed in, driving from, you know, car to building to car to building, you know, just box to box to box. And so it's just, I just keep having this funny kind of moment of like, here's Melanie, you know, and a person from the indigenous worldview who's basically saying like, just maybe kind of look up a little bit, like, you know, just, so anyway, I just wonder, am I the only one having that feeling? Have you noticed that too, Melanie? Anybody else? Kind of like, anyway, yeah, partially emotionally reaction and partially a question.
No, thanks for sharing. And I think, I mean, so many folks talk about the disconnect from, you know, Mother Earth, and Tiokasin. We've yarned together several times and recorded a radio show. I mentioned he's Lakota, and he always, you know, points out people talking about, you know, we have to save Mother Earth, our Earth Mother, and then he says, no, what we have to do is let her save us. And so there's sort of this arrogance, I think, in an anthropocentric bias that we all have. We're socialized into it. And in my sort of decolonizing myself, I think about that. And where I get to experience it in sort of an embodied practice is on the land. And I'm very fortunate to, I just moved back home. And so I'm, you know, in ceremony, I'm on the land helping. And the land as first teacher, or land as like pedagogy, that disconnect is, you know, it's so systemic. I think that's why I'm drawn to systems thinking and systems dynamics, because there's a tendency to feel grief, you know, maybe shame sometimes, where it's like, yeah, I really allowed myself to be swept up with modernity, and I hop in my car, and maybe I even hop in an electric car now. But am I really out on the land, engaging with the land? Am I, you know, and then folks will grow their own food, and other people will not, and other people are too poor to do something. Other people are, you know, in the global south, are dealing with huge issues, and it feels like almost a luxury to do systems awareness and analysis. And so the complexity mindset of the space between different ways of knowing, it's nice because I find it nice because it transcends those types of dichotomies that people get polarized and paralyzed in the middle of it. And the disconnection from the land, I remember giving a talk a couple of years ago, and there was a gentleman from Rome, and he said, how do I connect to Mother Earth when it's cobblestones and, you know, canals and lots of human-made architecture? And I said, well, the elders have often said to me, beneath all of that is Mother Earth. And a lot of those materials come from Mother Earth, you know, and now we have, you know, architects and engineers looking at how does the earth naturally behave in that area. And so the human settlement patterns, and I think the relationship that humans have with the earth, our Earth Mother as the commodity that serves us, you see a different worldview when you hear something like the Haudenosaunee, for example, when they give their Thanksgiving address, which is the words that come before all else, which takes hours, but I'll get my Uncle Dan to do that sometimes, and you know he'll offer the words. But they talk about the sky world to below the turtle, and they acknowledge all of the beings. And in our relationship with food, he will speak to the food. So when we have lunch together, he will speak to the food, because in the creation story, the food was given the responsibility, the food being the animals and the plants, the water, everything that nourishes us. Mother Earth has given us everything we need to survive as human beings. And our only responsibility was to ensure their survival back. But we've disconnected so much that we don't, you know, we're not thinking about the trillions of sea life. We're not thinking about the destruction of the coral reefs and the land, because we're caught up in these really big systems. And then when you do systems thinking and you introduce people to those concepts like the iceberg model, you go way down and say, oh, we just have to shift capitalism. We just have to transform, you know, these big world systems that nation states and of course capitalists have bought into. And now we have these really multi-billionaires and still all these poor people. So those disconnects, I think, happen. And I'll just maybe finish up here and say that I'm constantly and continually learning from the land, and then remembering how much I have to learn from the land. Like even when I'm on the land and I have the opportunity to be there in ceremony, because in our Mama Dasu, in our sweat lodge, you will hear teachings because you're doing it. So you're not hearing them like you read it in a book, which is helpful though. I mean, books like Braiding Sweetgrass are beautiful. But you will just be taught something like, this is the time that the maple flows. And so we're maple syrup people, we're tapping the trees, but the most healing medicine is the maple water. And this is how you cultivate it. And this is why. And then what I like to do is then apply that to systems and complexity and say, what am I learning? Like, what's the protocols? There's two, I guess, important ideas in learning from the land, is the protocols around it and the principles. The protocols, which we might violate. So if you ever have an opportunity to go to a ceremony, you might inadvertently violate a protocol. There shouldn't be anyone sort of like giving you heck or being mean, but they'll tell you, you have to give an offering, for example, before you harvest medicine. And that may not be your culture, but out of respect, you say, okay, how do I give that offering? And then you can practice that idea, even if it's just giving thanks, and to say, wow, I'm actually using something from Mother Earth that was gifted to me, and I'm in a reciprocal relationship with that being. And I need to kind of remember that. And we do that when we drink tea, for example. And so for our brothers and sisters from the East, tea is medicine, mushki ki. Mushki ki means mushk, he or she is strong, and ki is the land. And so mushki ki in our language, medicine, means the strength of Mother Earth. And so I drink all kinds of teas, and teas that weren't indigenous to Turtle Island. So teas that come from China and Japan and India. And then I'll have tea and drink that, and I'll have the teachings from the East, but I'll have my teachings as well. And somewhere in between, as long as I'm respecting the protocols of both of those cultures, I'm not appropriating, my own culture or their culture if I'm drinking tea. And then respecting where that lineage is, where it comes from. And that's part of our seventh fire prophecy. So we had a prophecy that human beings, all of us, the four nations, would come to a fork in the road. And we're going to choose that path of destruction, or we're going to choose to kind of shift our way, like transform our systems. That's not how the elders said it, but that's how I would say it. We would transform our systems. I mean, the elders and our ancestors say, yeah, that's what we meant. The Hopi talk about the two-hearted to the one-hearted people. And Thomas Bianca, if you remember, the Hopi elder in 1992, he went and he spoke at the House of Micah. And Oren Lyons, Haudenosaunee elder, accompanied him. That was the United Nations. There was bad weather that day, but in 1992, before the Rio Earth Summit, he talked about those prophecies. And Oren Lyons talked about the prophecies. But if you use the word prophecy, you know, in an academic or scientific setting, you might get looked at funny. So that's the invitation, is to be on Mother Earth as much as you can, learn from that, and have experiences, you know, there, because that's how the land is a teacher. And you can learn so much from, you know, just kind of being, I guess, present to those and listening to the frequencies. I think that's what he was talking about. Yeah, so exactly what you were saying. Open up, look up and open up and say, what is that tree teaching me when it's doing that? Or what lesson have I learned in being in relationship with that tree? You know, in Hawaii, they hug trees. And if you're lucky, you will feel its heartbeat and hear its breathing. And when they make their big seagoing vessels, right, they have to find old trees. And there's a Hawaiian elder who told me, well, we go and we sing to the trees and we wait for them to sing back. And once we were singing to a tree and the tree said, move on, I'm only 400 years old. And that's how you'll hear the elders talk all the time. It's so natural for them to be in a sentient relationship. And I still have to struggle to make sure that I'm open to those frequencies, that I can hear that song, you know, from that tree.
And Karen, I just want to fit in your question before we close.
Thanks so much, Felicia. And Melanie, thank you so much for just being so inspirational. And yeah, it's been a fantastic experience. I recently read David Abram, The Spell of the Sensuous, and I was really struck by the personal practice that he mentioned, that healers who work between nature and the society have to have in order to mediate between the two. And you may have just actually answered this, but I just wondered, as opposed to ritual, what would be your personal practice in developing that relationship with Earth?
Yeah, so I'm looking at the time, so I'm going to answer very briefly. I think we've reached our time, but I think that personal relationship, there's so much in the colonization or empire building of the world that discounted and mythologized the cultural and spiritual practices of nations around the world. And so Arkan Lashwala talks about re-indigenizing humanity. And so that's why I say decolonization. All of those things create the binary, the West, you know, indigenous and indigenous peoples. We do have our own cultural practices and rituals and ceremonies for connecting to Mother Earth, but there were practices all over the world. And so in some ways it's uncovering that lineage. You know, I've been in ceremony, for example, in Europe with people that are reconnecting to spirit helpers like dragons, and the dragon people, which is a whole other story. But I was in Gortsa, Slovenia, and one of their spirit helpers is a dragon, which is related to our Thunderbird. And to be in ceremony with dragon people who dream about dragons, and there's a castle, and the moat was put down on the neck of the dragon. And yet for so many generations, they probably thought they were crazy, is the word people use. I thought I was crazy because I dreamt of dragons. And it's like, but they were mythologized, because if people believe in dragons, how are they going to build empires and listen to the state and, you know, and kind of be colonized into whatever, I guess, state wants. And so those are a recognition. And I think that happens in a lot of different practices that you can study. There's different teachings, but I guess it's always about recognizing and being careful who's saying that and why they're sharing that, if they have the right protocols to share that knowledge, because some of it has to be done in person and with teachers, you know, that you trust. So, but one of the things is certainly through food and through a lot of probably the work that some of you do, in fighting for Mother Earth, you know, in being a warrior and always remembering her in all those conversations, using your platforms to bring her to the table and speaking for the ones that can't speak, you know, for the whales that are running out of salmon. And when I was a kid, my mom gave me a book by Chief Dan George. You might remember, he was an actor. And there was a book called My Heart Soars and My Spirit Soars. And he talked about the wolf ceremony. And I used to cry every time I read this. And it's just this simple. He said, I took my grandson into the bush and I shared a drum song, and it was the wolf song. And he said, and when we used to sing that, the wolves would answer us. So we would sing that song and the wolves would howl. He goes, and I took my grandson to the bush and I sang the song and I didn't hear any wolves. And my grandson said, can I go watch TV now? And he said, that's my greatest fear, is that we won't remember those songs, we won't sing them anymore, and that the wolves won't answer us back. And that like made me cry when I was 13 or 14, and I thought, I got to learn more about my culture. I have to learn. So the wolves always can talk to us and we can talk to them. Because when we lose that, like, why are we here if we lose that relationship with them? So yeah, so whoever you are in relationship with, those spirit beings, those animals that you're drawn to, that's your spirit answering, not your rational mind. That's your soul answering. That's why you're fighting for them, I think. Yeah, just acknowledging the food every time you eat is a good way to do that too. Miigwech. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us today, and especially to you, Melanie. And as Carrie said at the beginning, Carrie said, I'd like to sit at the feet of Melanie and learn forever. And I think we all can feel some of that as we close here today. So thanks to Carolina and Carrie, my co-hosts. And as you mentioned in the chat here, you guys, there's the Joanna Macy talk coming up in September. There's a link there, and we'll be sending out the link to this video sometime in the next week once we get it up, and invite you to join us for the future conversations and everything else. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
everyone. Thank you,
Melanie.
Melanie.
Thank you, everyone.
Enjoy the pool, Melanie.
Yeah.
Thank you very much to all of you.